From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the library's Center for the Book. The center, I was just reflecting with our speaker, was created under Dan Borston more than 30 years ago when Dan was the Librarian of Congress. And it was created to stimulate public interest in books, reading, and literacy. Our present librarian, Dr. James Billington, is a friend of today's speaker and was hoping to be able to be here, but unfortunately he could not join us today. Since its founding through Public Law 95-129 in 1977, the Center for the Book has relied on private funding to support all of its activities. Only our 6 permanent staff positions are paid by appropriated funds. 4 of us are in the Madison Building office, and 2 are located in the Jefferson Building, 1 in the Poetry and Literature office, and the other in the relatively new, and of which we are very proud, Young Readers Center. The center's activities have a broad reach. We play a major role in the Library of Congress National Book Festival, held on the National Mall for the last 13 years. We celebrate writers, books, and reading nationally through our affiliated State Centers program. And we administer the library's brand new Literacy Awards program, which is international in scope and sponsored by philanthropist David Rubenstein, who also is a major supporter of the library and of the National Book Festival. During the past year, the center has sponsored more than 20 noontime author talks, such as this one, in our Books and Beyond series. Thank you for joining us. The series features authors of new books that somehow have a special connection with the Library of Congress, often though not as directly in the largest sense as the book we're discussing today. Each talk is filmed for later webcasting on the library's website. These webcasts, now approaching 300 in number, expand greatly the reach of the series. And I should add that nearly 800 author talks from past National Book Festival programs in the fall are also available on the website. It's really quite a remarkable resource that we are trying to promote and make much more widely known. Because this talk is being filmed, I ask you to turn off all things electronic. Our format will be a presentation by Mr. Kaiser, then a brief question and answer period followed by a book signing. And if you participate in the question and answer period, you also are giving the library permission for your possible inclusion in the website presentation. Thank you very much in advance. This is the book. The topic really could not be more relevant: how Congress works and how it doesn't, and the consequences of these ups and downs in our history and in the history of our democracy. Mr. Kaiser's vehicle for telling and reflecting on this story is the dramatic journey of the sweeping financial reform bill, the Dodd-Frank Act, that became law in response to the great crash of 2008. It is a personal book. It is beautifully written, and it's a behind-the-scenes account. One reviewer even called it a legislative page-turner. Both Senator Dodd and Congressman Frank and their staffs collaborated with the author, which adds both authenticity and a real behind-the-scenes, you-are-there flavor to this tale. Robert G. Kaiser has been with the Washington Post since 1963. He has reported on the House and the Senate. He was a correspondent in Saigon and Moscow, served as national editor at the Post, then managing editor, and now associate editor and senior correspondent. His books include Russia, The People and the Power, 1976, So Damn Much Money, The Triumph of Lobbying and Corrosion in the American Government, 2009, and with Leonard Downey Jr., The News About the News, American Journalism in Peril, 2002. He has received an Overseas Press Award, Club Award, and a National Press Club Award, and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Please join me in welcoming Robert Kaiser. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. We should all be reminded of the wonderful comedians Swan and Flanders, which some of you may be old enough to remember, Englishmen, whose record of their show, I just listened to it again a couple of days ago. It makes me laugh. And Flanders explains to the audience that this is being recorded, therefore it's going to be part of posterity. And where you're sitting now is where you'll be in posterity. Me too. This is a lovely introduction, and John has exactly captured my purpose, my mission here, which is to write a book whose readers would hopefully come to understand how this thing works, and to use this one case study as an example. It got me into a little bit of trouble because, as anyone who's dealt with them knows, the issues of financial regulation are difficult, complicated, and arcane. As Barney Frank said many times now, doing this bill, says Barney, I had to learn an awful lot of things that I never really wanted to know. I felt similarly, I have to confess. I didn't learn them as well as he did, I don't think, but I did spend a lot of time trying to learn them. And interestingly, sitting at the console, I spent a lot of time trying not to bore my readers with too many of the details. So the issues are all in here, but I hope in a way that's digestible by the young and the old, but I leave it to you to decide. This is a book which I hope conveys something about that which I have decided is really the most important thing to understand about the Congress, if we have any hope of understanding why we nearly drove over a cliff last week, why so many members, why so many members willingly voted to put their country into bankruptcy, which was an extraordinary thing to do. 168 Republicans did that. I wonder if some of them may live to regret it. I have no idea what will happen. But the idea that elected members of the House and Senate said, I know what we ought to do. We ought to go bankrupt. It seems to be quite an amazing thing to have happened. These events were a reflection of the culture of the modern Congress, which I'm going to talk about today briefly and then happily try to answer some questions about afterwards, or anything else that's on your mind. Do not ask me, however, if you want an answer, don't ask me what Mr. Bezos is going to do with my newspaper, because I don't yet know, although we're all quite hopeful. I have an answer today to this question of what is the culture and why is the culture what it is, but it's not an entirely satisfying answer because it isn't very simple. In this age of tweets and clever one-liners, my specialty, I've come to realize, which is ambiguous answers to complicated questions, is utterly out of fashion. But I'm going to give you some ambiguous or complicated answers in hopes that they might be helpful. Institutions have cultures. John Cole and I have just been talking about the culture of the Library of Congress. It's established over the last, now 50 years, I guess, by two very distinguished scholars, both of whom have very large egos and who love to make their institution as big and rich and important as they possibly could, Dan Porston and Jim Billington. And they've both done extremely well at this. And I think, as I said to John earlier, without those egos, they wouldn't have done as well. But the Washington Post has a culture. It's an interesting fact for Mr. Bezos, who does seem to appreciate it, I'm pleased to say, and to understand its specialness. But the cultures are firmly fixed. Anthropologists and sociologists tell us that they don't change very easily or very quickly. And yet, In the years that I've been up here in this neighborhood as a reporter, which literally began with my first job in journalism in the summer of 1962, when I was a copy boy for the AP in the House Press Gallery across the street. From then to now, the culture of the Congress has changed radically. And this was brought home to me in a kind of final, conclusive way in the year and a half that I spent reporting this book and getting to know some wonderful people who worked for Chris Dodd and Barney Frank, who helped me understand what was going on and helped me understand how the thing now works. I think everybody in the room knows that our politics aren't what they used to be. But it seems to me that an awful lot of Americans haven't really come to grips with how fundamentally things have changed. The government shutdown was probably helpful to such people to come to grips with the fact that this is a different kind of a game, a new game. The subtitle of my book refers to Congress as our essential national institution. I think this is indisputably the case. When Congress doesn't work, the country isn't governed effectively, the sad position that we find ourselves in at the moment. It seems to me now, having studied the matter as the way I have, that the culture of this Congress, the modern Congress, is sadly actively hostile to creative problem solving. I got an extraordinary perch to watch this story unfold and to learn about this culture, thanks to Barney Frank and Chris Dodd. John described it. Both of them agreed from the outset to let me talk to them at regular intervals throughout this process in tape-recorded interviews, which I'm going to donate to the Library of Congress, that were fascinating. I've got 110,000 words of transcribed Dodd and Frank, and they're really quite intriguing. But more important, as I've indicated, to me, was the authorization to their staffs to let me in on the secrets, such as they were. Let me see what was going on. Let me talk to everybody in real time so that I could find out what was happening. Usually, this is part of the culture that hasn't changed, usually the staff simply disappears from press accounts of the doings of modern Congress. This is a conspiracy happily engaged in by members and staff alike. Its purpose is to make members look important, to make them look like they're in the know and doing all the details and on top of all the details and so on. This, however, is not the case. The staffs do the work often. I'll return to that in a moment. Excuse me. When they do talk to reporters, and they do all the time, they do so on background or deep background so that their names never appear in the papers or on television. So I got to break through that. Happily, two of the heroes of my book are women who were the key players on each side. Amy Friend, the staff counsel of the Senate Banking Committee, and Jean Roslanowick, the staff director of the House Financial Services Committee. These are two formidable women, neither of whom are well known in the hip circles in Washington. Neither of them certainly are household names, although they were very well known among the teams of lobbyists trying to influence this bill, who understood what an important role they would play. I also persuaded a dozen members of both houses, Republicans and Democrats, who I expected to be important players in this process, to also meet with me regularly. So I have some wonderful interviews all the way through. I'm particularly grateful to two Alabamians, Richard Shelby, the ranking Republican on the Senate Committee, and Spencer Baucus, the ranking Republican at the time on the House Committee, with whom I had multiple conversations, and there were a number of others. This sounds a little boastful, I know, but I want to emphasize, particularly for posterity over there behind that camera, that I really got a break here as a reporter. This access that I was given allowed me a really unique view. I don't know of another book like this. If someone does, please tell me about it. I don't think it exists. where in a big, important piece of legislation, all the key authors were on the record with a reporter all the way through the process. This was really fun for me and allowed me to write a book which I'm very proud of, which I think really does provide an education in how the thing works. When I began, of course, I didn't know what was going to happen. Dodd used to tease me, what if we don't get a bill? And what are you going to write about? Well, I suppose I could have written about a failure, but it wouldn't have been as much fun, and it certainly wouldn't have been as rewarding. So we were all lucky in the end that something happened. And as I'll come back to this. Before it ended, I got a real education in this culture and got to really understand what I think, what's changed. I'm going to go over a few of the big things that I think are important about what's changed, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. First example, competitive partisan politics have transformed Congress since the mid-90s. Newt Gingrich is a very important figure, in my view, in the history of Washington. I wrote about him in my book, So Damn Much Money, about lobbying, and I write about him again here because I think he was so important. And readers will discover that I am not a member of a Newt Gingrich fan club. But his triumph in 1994, leading his Republicans for the first time in half a century to control both houses of Congress, was a triumph, to be sure, and it had a big impact because literally ever since that 94 election, every 2 years in the biennial congressional elections, we have another contest for all the marbles. Who is going to control the Congress? This has resulted in extraordinary party discipline, so that now both parties in the House, I think, behave much more like parliamentary parties than old-fashioned American political parties. When I grew up here on the Hill in the 70s, I covered the Senate for 2.5 years in the 70s, and there were as many, in that Senate, for example, there were as many liberals among the Republicans in the Senate as there were real liberals among the Democrats. There was a big tent in both parties that covered a very broad spectrum of political opinion, and there was very little party discipline. No important bill that I covered in the 70s passed either house on a party line vote. Never happened. But now, in this context of this every 2 years shootout for all the marbles, we have perpetual campaigning and perpetual political warfare. It's in the papers every day. This morning about the filibuster of judicial appointments in the Senate, another example. But it's been an extremely fundamental, profound change. Interesting second fact, political warfare and perpetual campaigning are expensive. They cost a lot of money. And the demand for money has also had a transformative impact on the Congress and altered its culture. I think that this demand for money, which requires people to raise so much for every campaign, has really affected who chooses to run for the House and the Senate. Today's members have to spend a day or two, and sometimes 3, on the telephone doing what they all describe as dialing for dollars. They sit over at the Republican Campaign Committee or down the street at the Democratic Campaign Committee, which has set up banks of telephones and little desks for them to do this, and they dial numbers provided to them by their staffs, or very often now, by a new kind of Washington hustler called a campaign finance consultant, who has produced a list of people who have given either to that member or to like-minded members. Often this list will include the name of the person's spouse, children, so that the member can pretend on the phone to be their close old pal. And they sit there dialing, asking strangers for money. Think about this. They don't like to brag about it, so we don't hear about it from them all the time. But this is now a routine part of the job. It's a demeaning enterprise, in my opinion. I can't imagine it doing it myself. And I can't imagine the gentleman for whom this building is named doing it. Can you imagine James Madison riding around Virginia on his horse, asking strangers for money? Or in the modern era, Everett Dirksen or Howard Baker? This is a very new departure, and not a good one. Money has changed the makeup of Congress. We have a lot more wealthy members now than we used to, and we have these people who don't mind begging from strangers. Speaking of strangers, here's another weird aspect of the culture of today. Although it's an organization composed of backslapping politicians, strangely, weirdly, most of them are genuine strangers to one another. If you leave your family at home, spend only 3 or 4 days a week in Washington, which is the norm now, and your main preoccupation is partisan warfare, you just don't make friends across the aisle. Loyalty now runs to party, not to institution or to policy issue. There was a terrific example of this in a recent article about a month ago by my extremely talented young colleague, Eli Saslow. Keep an eye on Eli Saslow, one of the most creative reporters we've had on the Post in a long time. He got into the head of one of the Tea Party activists, a very interesting character named Steve Sutherland, a former funeral director in the Florida Panhandle, who's now an active member of the Tea Party caucus. And he's the author of the food stamp changes that passed the House last summer. Changes that would radically cut food stamps, and which are still the subject of negotiations in the conference going on now over the Farm Bill. Saslow was present when Sutherland explained to his daughter that he had never met the leading Democrat in the House, who was an expert on food stamps, who is Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. And I'm going to read you a little bit from Eli's story. What, the daughter said to her father, seriously? Never met him? That doesn't make sense. She knew, Eli writes, that her dad was a conciliator who loved mentoring young men at church, who loved his yearly hunting trips with his 3 siblings, and his funeral director retreats to the mountains. Your whole thing is connecting with people, she said. Everybody likes you. And yet, here was another Washington lawmaker elected to solve the same problems, who had become an expert on the same issue, who worked in the same place, and her dad had not even met the guy? Can't you ask him to coffee, she asked. You could work together. Oh, that wouldn't play so well with a conservative base, said one of the congressman's aides who was at the table with them in a fast food restaurant. Or back in the district, said a second aide. Honey, look, Sutherland said, staring intently at his daughter, pleading with her to understand. Washington is a runaway freight train. There isn't time for anything. He reached for 2 empty milkshake glasses to help him illustrate the problem. Setting the glasses side by side on the table, their rims touching. This is me, and this is the other guy when we got to Washington. Different ideas, different people, but we're close. We're touching. Democrat and Republican. We could do something with this. Then he started slowly to pull the glasses in separate directions, ticking off reasons for the widening divide. Fundraising campaigns, he said, moving the glasses further apart. Votes, strategy, rushing around, lobbyists, name-calling, he continued, spreading the glasses further. I have my meetings and they have theirs. I run by them, they run by me. It's all about winning, 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 winning. Winning, not fixing problems, defines all. The wisdom of Steve Sutherland. That fixation on winning reflects another fundamental change in the culture of our politics, the culture of our Congress, In the modern age, politics has trumped policy. This was explained to me by the wonderful Lee Hamilton, a longtime congressman from Indiana, with a huge reputation in this neighborhood for many years. So good that when President Bush needed to appoint a 9/11 commission, he made Lee Hamilton its co-chairman. Hamilton's a Democrat, told me that he thought politics began to displace policy in the early 1980s, after the Reagan election, or the Reagan election. By now, the preeminence of politics over policy, I think, is obvious, and in my view, serious. I saw it vividly in my reporting for the book. I came to realize that of the 535 members of the House and Senate, there really weren't more than 24 who had a really sophisticated understanding of the issues of financial regulatory reform. Most of them saw these issues as obscure as medieval Chinese philosophy. And the experts have already been depleted in number because two of them, Dodd and Frank, have retired. Their successors as chairman of those two committees are not remotely their equals. Another important fact, probably not a new one, but very vivid in this story: fear is the great motivator in Congress. Crises produce fear. I conclude that this was the key to the passage of Dodd-Frank, because the Great Crash produced so much fear in Congress. Generally, for most members, the greatest fear is that he or she will be blamed for the crisis of the moment. Blame avoidance is the first reflex on Capitol Hill. But interestingly, as I saw it in this case, a genuine crisis can increase the political risks of inaction to the point where they may appear greater to many members than the risk of actually doing something, even if it proves imperfect. I conclude in the book that reality is very important to the passage of Dodd-Frank. Also, Congress is a reactive institution. In the modern age, it typically reacts to proposals from the executive branch rather than taking initiatives on its own. This isn't what the Founding Fathers, and particularly Mr. Madison, expected, but it is now the normal procedure. When I started my reporting, I was a little naive about this. I expected both Dodd and Frank to be more the initiators of this legislation than they turned out to be. In fact, as Frank made clear to me early on, he really wanted the Obama administration to draft a bill that his Financial Services Committee could consider, react to, and perhaps amend. Dodd initially did have the ambition of doing his own proposal, and he made a pretty radical proposal in September of 2009 that called for replacing all the existing regulatory agencies with one new one. Every one of his colleagues dumped on this idea or ignored it. He did not find a single supporter in the Senate for this proposition. So ultimately, he too had to follow Frank's lead and accept the Obama administration's draft as the template for reform. Another characteristic of this new culture: non-expert members do a poor job processing complicated legislation. In this case, a huge bill with fundamental consequences for the biggest sector of the American economy passed through the House and Senate without ever being carefully debated. The Senate Banking Committee never held a proper markup of the bill, a section-by-section review of its provisions. Financial Services did a markup, but it was surprisingly cursory. The floor debates in both houses consisted mostly, I thought, of rhetorical flourishes related not to financial regulation, but to political posturing. Members never engaged in a serious philosophical debate about the proper role of government regulation in the financial sector, or in a practical discussion of how regulation might make the system safer. This is going to baffle future historians who go back and look at the record in both committees and on both houses' floors of the debate of the bill. In the end, most members really had only the sketchiest notion of what was in it or what it would do. As a result, all but a tiny handful, voted the party line. Democrats aye, Republicans no. At one point I asked Barney about the indifference to policy of so many of his members. And he thought it wasn't a surprise at all. I thought it was a basic reflex. This notion, he said, that members of Congress are power hungry, no, it's absolutely the opposite. Most members, said Frank, like to duck tough issues. And of course, we know that's right. The politics of reform, on the other hand, was on many members' minds from the outset, including, of course, Dodd and Frank. Beginning early in 2009, Frank was talking about political implications with Speaker Nancy Pelosi and White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who was his good pal, former member of the House. Both Pelosi and Emanuel thought that a strong bill would be very good for Democrats. Emanuel repeatedly told Frank and his staff about White House polls, which showed how popular tough reform would be in the country. However, when pressure from hometown bankers and financial industry lobbyists weakened some Democrats' resolve on the committee in the summer of 2009, Barney had to warn them to hang tough. If you kill this bill, he told his Democrats on the committee, you'll get creamed. You'll get primary opponents. It'll be the people against the banks. And the Democrats caved in again. He was able to hold the line, but it was a battle. Republicans saw regulatory reform through political lenses too. Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, the Republican leaders of the Senate and the House, used the issue to raise money, particularly on Wall Street, telling financiers, mostly in private events that we didn't get to see as reporters, one of which, however, leaked out, which has helped my book. They told these Wall Streeters that only the Republicans could temper the appetite for new regulation, and that they should therefore support the Republicans who would try to do that. This produced a lot of new campaign contributions. Interestingly, before 2008, for 4 years, Wall Street money went more to Democrats than to Republicans. After 2008, that flipped back. Another characteristic which I've alluded to already, weak members empower staff. This was new to me. I didn't fully appreciate it. I discovered a good line in Ted Kennedy's memoir, which was published at the end of his life, which unfortunately has one chapter devoted to the Senate. I think is the best chapter, or the most educational chapter in the book. In it, Kennedy writes, quote, 95% of the real nitty-gritty work on legislation is now done by the staff. This, said Kennedy, represents a reallocation of energies in the era that I've been in the Senate. It certainly does. In my story, the two women I've mentioned, Jean Ross-Lanowick and Amy Friend, had more influence on the bill than any members of either committee other than Dodd and Frank themselves. They presided over the careful, detailed, line-by-line vetting of the legislation that members avoided. The staff of the two committees, under Jean and Amy, spent thousands of hours, literally thousands, consulting with practitioners, listening to the pleadings of lobbyists, drafting legislative language, consulting with officials and experts downtown, considering the implications of various provisions, and so on. In the end, I concluded that the staff may have done more than 95% of the work on the Dodd-Frank bill. Another characteristic of this culture, which may sound counterintuitive, but is very real. The fact that most members of the House and Senate are indifferent to policy, weak on substance, and ineffective at legislating doesn't seem to matter, particularly in the realm that all of our politicians care most about, electoral politics. As our politics have degenerated into tribal rivalry, the realities of budgets, tax policies, global warming, and the like rarely make an appearance in election campaigns. Elections are almost never resolved on the basis of a serious debate on policy. Slogans, emotions, partisanship, and 30-second TV spots are all much more important. Even the smart, serious members, and there are quite a few, not enough, usually can't campaign on the issues. Here's the most fundamental reality of the Congress. It is an utterly human institution. It reflects a huge, vibrant, and diverse human society, the United States of America. Congress is representative in every sense of that word. It represents ignorance, greed, emotion, crass materialism, moral corruption, and the nobler qualities of the electorate. But we don't get a House and Senate that are any better than we are. In this case, in my opinion, the country was lucky. Dodd and Frank were remarkable leaders. Readers of this book will see that this bill would not have survived without either one of them. They were both crucial to the success of the enterprise. But of course, they won't be there next time because they've both retired. That's the end of my prepared thoughts. Let's have a discussion. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question.
I have a three-part answer.
What is the role of the press in supporting the culture that you have described in Congress? And on the other hand, how much does Congress seek the support of the press to support the culture?
Very. Yes. Question is, what's the role of the press in supporting this culture, and to what extent does the Congress seek the support of the press for the way it's doing business? I'm not going to try to defend the press or the media, both organizations to which I never applied for membership and for whom I can't answer. I'm trying to answer for the behavior of this wonderful institution where I've spent 50 years, amazingly, but that's as far as I'll take it. But let me say this. The congressional preoccupation with politics over policy is very distinctly echoed in the media's preoccupation with who's ahead, who's up, who's down, horse race politics in the broadest sense that you see and read every day. It's easier for journalists, as it is easier for politicians, not to master or deal with the tough, complicated issues. And what I said at the outset, I strongly believe, all serious, difficult issues, by their nature, must be complicated, must not lend themselves to simple answers. That's just the way the world is. And so journalists like simple answers as much as politicians do. So it's much easier not to cope. I do think that if you read the serious newspapers, which we're really down to 3, sadly, you can learn a lot about the serious policy issues. All 3 organizations go out into the country and into the world to explore how things really work, what's really going on, and try in Washington to seriously cover what's going on. But I say this in a totally immodest way, But I learned from this experience how far removed the reporters on the beat often are in a story like the Dodd-Frank bill from what's really going on. This book is full of really interesting meaty episodes which were never mentioned in any newspaper or on any broadcast. The members and the staffs up here are very effective at conducting their business on an untransparent level that isn't widely seen or reported. But if I think I heard the implication of your question correctly. It doesn't matter if I did or not. The truth is that the Congress doesn't care as much anymore about what we think or what we write about them. This is a sad but very real fact. I write in the book about the wonderful remark years ago now by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said more than once, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, that's no longer the case. If you listen to the global warming deniers, for example, they've got their own facts and they're sticking to them. And in fact, on issue after issue now, we don't just have conflicting opinions, we have facts that are inconsistent, don't coexist, can't coexist. So this is a big problem. I think the decline of intellectual standards in this town generally is a source of sadness to me. We're an institution which is fighting this all the time and with some success. It's interesting that the Congress still just depends on the Library of Congress Research Service to an extraordinary extent. I don't think that's well appreciated, really, the degree to which offices turned over here for help to actually understand what the facts might be. But that's a rare exception, sadly. Yeah.
If the gerrymander system exists now, how can we have real representative democracy? And secondly, how do you fix the gerrymander system?
Question is, excuse me, given the gerrymandering that, I'll come back in a sec. Given the gerrymandering that we have now and the system that creates it, how can we fix this? And what can we do? I apologize. As I said at the end, and how can we get representative government, the gentleman asked, with this system? I fear that we do have representative government, as I said at the end, that this idea that there's some noble course to be followed if only people would listen to the voters. They are listening to the voters. They're not, of course, a lot of Americans aren't voters. That may be part of the problem. But I don't think we can blame gerrymandering for everything. In fact, there's a lot of new political science which shows that a very interesting phenomenon which makes gerrymandering easier is at least as much at fault, and that is the tendency of people now to make their homes in neighborhoods and communities and states where the predominant views are similar to their own. So we have, by self-selection, overwhelmingly Republican and overwhelmingly Democratic areas in the country that make many safe seats for members of the House, not because of gerrymandering, just because of where people are living. But the gerrymandering is serious, and we know this because in the handful of states that have abolished it, led by Iowa and California, and are doing it by independent commission, the results are different. We're getting a different kind of person coming through. But this is, very few politicians make this an issue. It's only arisen in state politics, not in national politics. I'm asked, as you won't be surprised to hear, I'm asked every time I've spoken about this book, okay, you've described a horrible situation, how can we fix it? I have a cop-out, which is that reporters don't prescribe solutions, which is a cop-out. But the truth is I can't really prescribe a solution because I don't see a simple one that I could describe in a few minutes. But I do know one thing, that whatever the solution proves to be, and I do expect there will be one, I should say, this situation we're in now seems to me profoundly un-American. It's so impractical. It's so ridiculous on its face that we have a government shutdown and people voting for national bankruptcy. That just seems like something that can't last. So I expect, personally, some kind of discontinuity that's going to erupt and make this be different. I have no idea what it might be. But meanwhile, absent a much higher degree of citizen engagement and citizen involvement, I don't think there's much room for optimism here. As long as these gals and guys across the street think they can behave the way they do and get away with it and get reelected, we're not going to get a change. So that's the heart of the problem. They've got to be called out. They've got to lose elections because of what they're doing, or they're not going to stop doing it. Yeah, in the back.
What is your opinion currently of the Electoral College and the process that we elect a president?
What is my opinion of the Electoral College as a way to choose the president? This is tough for me. I believe that the founders came up with something pretty smart in this system. I just wrote a review that ran on Sunday in the Post of a very interesting book by Simon Winchester, a very talented British journalist who's become an American, interestingly, who's written a book about a lot of very interesting characters who helped bind the American nation together through discoveries, science, technology, and a lot of it. It's a good book, a lot of fun. And it makes you think about the fact that binding this enormous continental country together was no piece of cake and was not an inevitable success by any means. And I think that the system, the federal system of states, made that work and has made it work ever since. And that abolishing the Electoral College would gravely undermine the federal system. But having said that, I see what the weaknesses are, and I very much regret the fact that in the era of high technology campaigns that we now have, candidates for president can happily, literally, ignore California and New York and a lot of other places where the result is not in doubt. So if you live in Ohio, your sense of a presidential campaign is profoundly different than if you live in California or New York or lots of other safe states that nobody worries about campaigning in. So I see it's a huge problem. I'm nervous about abolishing it. And once again, I do not have the answer. Yeah.
You had some very complimentary comments about the staff directors of the committees. As someone who's been around Capitol Hill a long time, how do you assess changes in the quality of congressional staff over time?
You know, one of the biggest changes, lots of people in this room know about it, which I wrote about in my previous book too, is this revolving door, which has created opportunities, particularly for staff on Capitol Hill, to make piles of money that were beyond the wildest dreams of the first generation of staff people that I got to know well in the 70s. The rise of the lobbying industry and the realization of its practitioners that smart Capitol Hill staff made brilliant lobbyists has had an enormous impact. So that it's now standard, I think, for a considerable number of the people that come up here to go to work on the staffs to think of that as punching a ticket, temporary duty, come for a few years, and then go downtown and cash in. Now, there are also, and still today, people like Amy and Jean who have made this their careers, who accept that a top salary of $165,000 in a country whose median family income is less than $50,000 isn't a terrible sentence of poverty, and that you can actually live a life on such a salary and do good work. So we still do have a wonderful cadre of very dedicated, long-term aides on Capitol Hill. But it's a much smaller group than it was 20 or 30 or probably even 10 years ago. And I think it's going to be smaller still in the future. So this is, now, short-timers coming from very good education, full of energy and brain power, don't necessarily suggest a decline in the quality of the staff. And I don't feel competent to grade in an overall sense whether we've gone from A- to Z+ or anything of that kind. But I do think it's a different mindset. So you may have very bright people doing it, but if they're doing it really to cultivate their path to a more lucrative private sector career, then they're not like the old school. They're doing it a different way. Yeah.
My wife and I have spent most of the last 10 years in China, and this past week, the Chinese people learned of the new policies that will affect them for the next 10 years when the results of the third plenum were released publicly, and that of which the Chinese public had no relative little input. We will be returning to China in about 2 months for another stay there, and we anticipate that students will be asking us, how does the Chinese process compare to the U.S. process, and is the U.S. process something for which we should aspire?
Welcome home. Let's see. I was very impressed with that document, which I've just begun to read. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Some very bright people have taken on some huge policy issues and made some creative decisions. We'll see now, you know better than I, they have a hard time often implementing these things, but they've come up with some really interesting ideas. But they came up with them, as you suggested, pretty much in secret, behind closed doors. I covered the Soviet Union in the 70s. Curiously, much of what the Chinese do as a matter of organization and execution is based on the Soviet system. It's familiar to me. I know that these ideas were largely born in the staff of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. But they were substantive and substantial and creative, things that we're not so good at these days. So can we say we do this lots better than you do? Not so easily. Now, I wouldn't for a moment trade. I don't want a system remotely like theirs. And I do believe that we retain the saving grace of always being able to throw the bums out, which they don't have so far. But it's not as though we can be proud of what we're doing. And it was intriguing to read the stories during the shutdown from all over the world. I read The Economist every week. The Economist just couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it. How can you actually do this? Is quite a good question. So I think the natural American instinct to, oh, we do it best, we're the best, we're number one. We've got to look at that pretty hard. That's not so obvious to me anymore.
Time for one more question. I didn't mean to discourage it.
It's all right, we silence him.
Well,
Okay, here it is.
There it is.
The Republicans have a chairmanship system where they elect someone for a limited term. In the old days, and the Democrats still do it, it's basically seniority, and as long as you're in Congress, you retain that position. Is that exacerbated or ameliorated?
This is
Summarize that.
talking about the systems, the two different conflicting systems, really. The Republicans in both houses elect their committee chairman, and to get to chairmanship, you've got to win the approval of your peers, whereas Democrats have, with a surprising fervor, stuck very close to the seniority system and maintained it. I'm a Republican in this matter. I think it's a much better system. It tempers behavior, and the idea that you get to be chairman just because you outlast everybody ahead of you in seniority is not a system that's going to produce the best people in the chairmanships. If I may be personal about this, the move from Chris Dodd to Tom, what's his name, from South Dakota, Johnson, was not a step up in quality. Similarly, from Barney Frank to Maxine Waters was not a step up in brain power or quality. But in both places, in both Senate and House, no one said, wait a minute, those aren't the two best people for these jobs. There are better people available, which there certainly are on both committees. So it's a real problem for the Democrats, which I wish they'd come to grips with. But it does come up here in the book in an interesting way. I won't go into it now. This has been fun. Thank you very much. Good questions.
Well, I want to thank Bob Kaiser for sharing not only the secrets of this bill, but his personal feelings about the political system and politics, which have been such an important part of his life and our lives too. We are very much the legislative branch of the Library of Congress, and thank you for the little mention also of the work that CRS does. We're going to have a book signing. He'll be over here, and you'll have a chance to talk with him a little more, but let's conclude with another round of applause for Bob Kaiser, our speaker.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.